to Arden's Neurodiversity podcast. This is Arden's third year celebrating Brain Awareness Week, which is a global campaign held every March, focused on encouraging interest and support for brain science. This year we're exploring the concept of neurodiversity and we'll be interviewing a variety of individuals to explore just how diverse our brains can be and how that impacts our experiences. Our podcast will cover a diverse range of experiences that might cover stigma, personal struggles, or potentially triggering subjects. Some of these terms that we use might be unfamiliar, so we're going to quickly go over them right now. Neurodiversity is the understanding that neurocognitive diversity is a valuable part of biodiversity. Different ways of thinking, viewing, and experiencing the world contribute to our wider society, and there is no normal or ideal way to be. Neurodivergence is a term to differentiate those who deviate from the norm in their neurocognitive type without using medicalized deficit model language. Neurotypical doesn't mean neurologically privileged, but it does mean the world is set up to cater for this neurotype by default. It's important to note that self-diagnosis is valid and many undiagnosed people will have unmet needs, so a lack of diagnosis doesn't mean that someone's neurotypical by default.
Hi, Kurtis.
Hi.
Hi, Kurtis. It's so great to welcome you here, and we're really excited about you taking part in this interview for Brain Awareness Week at Arden University, in which we'll be talking with you about your experiences of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And I know that you have some very valuable life and professional experience to share with us today. Yeah, so without much ado, if it's all right with you, we'll begin with the interview.
Sure.
Okay. So, so the first question is really, what is your neurodivergence, if you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah.
And and then what does neurodiversity mean to you?
So in terms of my own neurodivergence, I have formal diagnoses, and I'm happy to share those, a couple of them anyway. I have quite severe OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, and I have mild Asperger's syndrome, which today goes under the more general heading autism spectrum disorder. And so they are different things, but in some ways they're connected, and I always think that, the overarching category is the person, and various diagnoses and other things are kind of assimilated within a person. And so I don't look at them as separate things. They are very much part of me. And so if you look at the second part of the question then about what neurodivergence means to me, I would say that it's at the same time a gift and a frustration.
Oh, right, yeah.
There are some things that are very useful to me about my own neurodivergences. One of them is that I'm highly detail oriented. And so it's no surprise that I ended up being a lifelong researcher. And the neurodivergence, helps me keep chipping away at the rock face in the mine, if you like. And I just don't give up with information. I just keep going after what I need. And so that is a great gift where it comes to doing research, because research is, after all, about pursuing leads. And often when you pursue one lead, you get leads to other things. And so neurodivergence comes in handy for that. I also...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So I also said that neurodivergence is a frustration to me, and that comes in the case of OCD. And so,
so basically, it's interesting because that actually leads into the second question, which is, how does your neurodivergence impact your daily or your academic life? So in that sense, you're obviously very much involved in academic work with research and so on, or you were. I'm not sure if you're still doing it, but Can you, could you just enlarge a little bit upon that maybe?
Yeah, so we won't go over all the ground that I've just done, but where it comes to conducting research, the neurodivergence is comes in very handy. Now, OCD is another story entirely, and so if we look at the impact of OCD, I won't go into a great amount of detail, but I'm just going to share one example with you that will underscore the difficulty connected with that diagnosis where it comes to research. And so, for example, one of the things in my own particular case of OCD that has been extremely difficult and posed a great impediment to my own work as a researcher is when I type, and I'm quite skilled at typing. Long before there were computers, I could type very quickly, doing it the proper way. And so I have no difficulty in using a keyboard. But for some reason, when at different times when I've been suffering from OCD and not getting a proper response from the medications I take for it, I've had to actually have the alphabet visibly displayed in front of me so that when I was typing, even though I don't even need to look at the keys, I could sort of see a precedent for each letter. Doesn't make a great deal of sense, but it's very time consuming. And eventually I found workarounds to make it easier for me to do my work. Some
So
days.
how often did that happen, if you don't mind me asking? Was that something that was on a daily basis, or was that?
Yeah, there were times when that would go on for months or even up to a year at a time. And given that I made my living from writing, it meant that I was spending 4, 5, 6 times the amount of time that it would have taken me to complete something. All the words were in my head. It was just a case of getting them on the page. And the other thing that happened connected with writing was that I developed my own stylized kind of handwriting. And nobody could read it. And there were times when I was overtired when I couldn't read it myself.
And so, sorry, what do you mean by stylized kind of handwriting? Was that a sort of an aid for yourself, an aid for you to understand, or was that just
it almost looked like a shorthand. You couldn't make out a single letter, and it turned out that when I could read it, I wasn't really reading it. I was simply remembering what I wrote. And so it's why when I was overtired and would look at the page and couldn't make it out, there was a reason for that. But part of neurodivergence for me is that I have a very good memory. And so I could actually remember what I wrote for pages and pages without being able to read it on the page.
Goodness, so sorry if you don't mind me interrupting just briefly. It's just made me realize that. So in some sense, what you're saying is that your neurodivergence, whilst it created amazing, it's given you amazing abilities, at the same time you've been, I don't know if that's the right word, battling other issues which were then sort of leveling off those abilities. So in a sense, your abilities and the issues that you were experiencing were almost leveling each other out. Is that right? Or were you still ahead?
Still ahead, but not without a great deal of effort. And so there's always been a gap between the amount of effort required for me to get words on the page, if you like, and what's going on in my head. And so I think very quickly, and I'm never at a loss for words in my head, but getting them on the page, even with, at least when I do it without the encumbrance of OCD, I can type very quickly. And so, but even then, I can't get words onto the page as quickly as they're
in your mind.
forming in my mind. Yeah.
Does that mean that you suffer from fatigue as well? Would that be,
yeah.
you do? Is that due to that because of the enormous effort that you have
Yes,
to do?
it is. Yeah. And so in terms of my working life, 18 hours a day of writing was normal for me at different times in my life.
Goodness me, yeah.
And so you can imagine.
That was because of, was that because of, was that were there various reasons, or was this because of battling the issues that you described?
Yeah, I would say that two things. I would say that when OCD presented a terrible encumbrance, the long hours were partly to ensure that I got the right amount done in a day, right? A sufficient amount done so that I could feel comfortable. But at other times when OCD wasn't such an encumbrance, the amount of hours I spent writing was to get things out of my head because I was concerned that they would disappear if I didn't get them on the page. And of course, experience has taught me that nothing ever leaves my brain. and so, like I've had the experience of losing documents partway through when I hadn't saved them properly. For example, draft emails. And when you draft a reply to an email and don't actually save it, it will disappear the next time if you hit backspace, it'll disappear unless you specifically save it. But I'm able to recreate even a very lengthy email very quickly, remember the exact words that I use. So as I say, it's a strange kind of thing where, I'm always, spending a lot of time trying to get out what's in my head and onto the page. But at the same time, sometimes being encumbered by OCD, which makes the act of typing more difficult and time consuming.
Goodness, yes, that's so interesting. Thank you. It actually basically leads on to our next question. I was going to ask how you adapt your specific needs. So if there's anything you'd like to add to that, I mean, I almost feel like you've pretty much covered that. But maybe as this was a question that was something that was very sort of important to you, I know that you thought that this is very important.
Yes.
Think about how people can actually help themselves. So I'd like to ask you that.
So, and I don't know what accounts for this, but the way my brain works, I have a very Baroque way of putting arguments together. And I used to try to reproduce that on the page, which was very annoying for professors and others who had to read what I wrote. And so a good piece of advice I was given was write the way you speak, because even though I'm very long-winded, the way I speak doesn't really bear much relation to the way I think. And so
sorry, would you mind explaining that a little bit? So the way you speak doesn't, you can.
So the way I think bears a lot more relation to formal logic and mathematics. And so I will use shorthand when I think. And I enjoyed taking courses in formal logic, mathematical logic, because it was very much a mirror of how my brain naturally works anyway. But of course, when you put an argument on the page that is in complete sentences, but is a logical shorthand for the longer story you're trying to tell. Well, it's English and it makes sense as English. It's very hard for somebody to follow because you're not putting cues for the reader in, the connective tissue that helps a reader with context and to move from one thought to the next.
Yeah.
And so unless they're prepared to do what mathematicians and logicians do, which is to take an argument or a proof as written, and be able to see what that looks like in terms of matching it with a diagram, let's say a geometrical diagram or a proof written in another form of shorthand, they're not going to understand. And somebody just expecting to read just prose is not looking for a mathematical shorthand when they read. And so the advice that was given to me was write as you naturally speak. Because some professors, when I was much, an undergraduate, noticed that there was a great deal of difference between the way I spoke to them and spoke up in class and the way my papers were written. And they pleaded with me to please just write them as I speak, because they said that I was very fluent when I spoke, but they had a great deal of difficulty with what I wrote. And so I followed that advice. But it actually requires a bit of gymnastics in my head to speak.
Well, yes, I think I can understand what you mean now. That's very interesting. I would never have imagined that before you said that. The differences between the way you might think and the way you might speak. That's a really, really, really interesting point.
It's a strange thing.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want to? Sorry, just going to ask. Do you want to add anything? I'm just wondering if you want to add anything else to any of the things, any other things that could help.
Yeah. So, I mean, a technique that I tried but abandoned was to actually, when writing a paper, for example, to just turn a tape recorder on and speak what I wanted to write into the tape recorder, and then just simply transcribe it.
I suppose actually you can do that nowadays in Google, can't one? I'm not Google, sorry, in Word.
Yes, and so that actually comes in handy nowadays for me. I end up making very few. You end up correcting a few mistakes here and there, but I don't tend to have to rewrite a great deal when I review a document that I've sort of spoken.
And sorry, but just to add as well, just quickly, because we need to move on to the joys of a neurodivergent mind. But before we do, very quick, already touched on that. Could you tell me, are there any ways in which you need to adapt for your specific needs during your daily life? Not just when you're sort of writing.
Sure.
Research, or just out of interest, if there's any other anything.
Yeah. So I'll speak to OCD, which is something people really don't like to talk about because it's deeply embarrassing and frustrating. But I will say this. One of the things that's quite common to people who have OCD is they tend to, engage in rituals like hand washing or brushing their teeth or washing the floors in their apartment. And they repeat these things over and over again to get them so-called right. And they're very agitated and anxious during this process, and until they get it right, and then even afterwards. And of course, the cognitive behavioral people who have skill in this area say, look, engaging in ritualized behavior like repeated hand washing or repetitive hand washing is not gonna, it doesn't really serve a practical purpose, in the sense that if you've washed your hands, you've washed your hands. You don't need to do it. But it also what it does to engage repetitively in something in the hope of getting it right, whatever that means for a particular person, just makes anxiety spike even higher or even further. And so the best way is to disengage from the activity and let the anxiety drop, and you'll find that you're no longer feeling like you need to get it right, so to speak.
Oh, thank you.
That's it's a very hard thing though for people with OCD to learn, and because because the rituals are compulsive in nature, and so you have to stop yourself from giving in or yielding to compulsion. And so that's a very difficult thing to do. So one thing that I found useful in order to, ratchet this OCD ritualization down is to swap one repetitive activity for another. And so to swap things that are less time consuming and annoying for things like hand washing that can be more time consuming and difficult. And so, for example, through the pandemic, the use of hand sanitizers, to protect people from spreading germs, and or viruses by touching their face with their hands or something, was an odd kind of thing. I mean, there were hand sanitizers before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, especially upon entering buildings and things, it was required of especially in healthcare settings, it was required of patients to use hand sanitizer, even if their hands were perfectly clean. And so it took a bit of getting used to, but after a while, what I thought was, if necessary, I can simply use hand sanitizer and not go to the bathroom and use water. And then I got to thinking, what I was thinking when I would go into a healthcare setting when I'd already washed my hands until they were raw. I thought, all right, so actually my hands are clean. Hand sanitizer is available, but since my hands are clean, I won't need to use it at all. And so that's a case of swapping one ritual for another until you get to the point where you don't need a ritual at all. So that's applied cognitive behavioral therapy, but it can be very difficult for a person with OCD to be that mindful.
I understand, but it's a very good illustration of really of all the sort of various, well, probably only some of the various things that you come up against in your daily life and in your professional life. So I'll quickly move on then, if you don't mind, to the joys of having a neurodivergent mind.
So I suppose, well, it might be annoying to some people. I enjoy having a good memory. A very detailed memory. And so, in a professional context, it comes in extremely handy. So, one thing I would always do in the days when we used libraries, physical libraries, was I would go to the shelves or the stacks or to the floor where the books for a relevant subject were, and I would literally go up and down the shelves looking at the titles. Then the next pass through, I would, for example, say, all right, so now I'm going to go and look for this particular topic, and I'd be able to pull the books off the shelves, no matter whether they're 4 stacks apart or 2 floors apart. I'd be able to pull all the books that I remember seeing that I wanted to look at. And then as I got reading them, if I saw a part of the subject there where I remembered seeing a title on a shelf somewhere else, I'd go and pull that. Or looking through a card catalog, for example, the same thing. I would look at every card very quickly, but look at every card, and then I wouldn't need to use that catalog again. And when looking through in the days when we had, there were reference books that had lists of journal articles on a particular subject or by a particular author. Again, I would scan that list, and then when I was writing, I would say, oh, wait, there were a few articles I remember coming across. Now, I hadn't actually held the pieces of paper in my hands, but I remember seeing the titles, and I remembered the titles and the names of the journals.
Wonderful.
And so I would be able in a library, after doing a scan of the catalog or of the spines of the books or of a reference work, I would then be set in terms of planning a day or of reading, because I could simply go from one to the next without having to run back to the card catalog and make note of a few more titles.
Goodness, I can really imagine that really is a joy to me. That's an amazing thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and
sorry, I beg your pardon. Yeah.
Well, no, it's just that you can see when you can do that, you can sort of almost categorize things that you want to do next. You can sort of say, right, well, the next, in order to write the next paragraph, I'm going to have to learn more about this, and I'm going to here are the things that I'm going to go and consult. So that's a joy.
No, that's amazing. It's really, it's very, very impressive, and it's very interesting to hear the joys and the things that you come up against and how they balance out. And I imagine it all being, I imagine the issues being very exhausting. And I'm glad that you have the joys to balance that out.
Yeah, and another example. Again, this is a research-related thing. When I was writing my PhD dissertation, what essentially I was doing was reconstructing a professor's set of lectures from the 18th century. And so I had the professor's own lecture notes, which were disordered. They were in some cases not dated, and they were written at different times. And because he hadn't published his lectures, it's very difficult to know in what order he gave them. What was an embellishment and what was the actual main text of what he was reading in class. And so what I did was I discovered notes kept by his students over a period of about 25 years, and transcribed everything, and then had to piece together his lectures as they changed over time. And that might sound like a difficult task, but actually I was able to, even considering, there some of the documents I had were on microfilm or microfiche. Others I had photocopies ready to hand. In other cases, I had transcriptions of my own transcriptions. I was able to see in a flash where there was divergence between the different sources of material and where there was convergence. And so I was able to say, right, well, clearly, this part of his lectures remained the same, and it appeared at this particular point in the course. At other times, he scrapped things entirely and improvised. And in other cases, he more or less maintained the outline of what he was doing, but then he made rather dramatic changes within it. And so all of that was fairly easy for me to see. The difficulty was getting it all on paper so that other people could understand.
Yeah, because you had the overview and the detail and the memory, and then you had the actual challenge of then translating what you had in your mind, which was no doubt in some kind of a logical shorthand, into a fluent, into something,
into a story.
Onto a story on the page.
Yes, and so that has in some ways, I like that challenge of telling a story, but it does require quite a translation of what's going on in my head.
Very interesting. I'm going to move on, if I may, because I'm aware of time constraints. So I'd just like to ask you just very, just briefly, really, do you feel connected to the neurodivergent or disabled community? I'm not sure if you want me to use those terms. I haven't actually asked you, I'm afraid, which terms you'd like me to use. I should have asked that at the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could tell me briefly.
I don't mind. I don't, well, I have described how, neurodivergence appears in my life. And I've said that, that the conditions, the neurodivergent conditions, don't really define me, but they're part of me. Having said that, I do know people who have a great deal of difficulty with OCD. I also know people who have difficulty with Asperger's, but I don't really feel part of a community, even though I've done a great deal of volunteering in the mental health world. I don't really feel part of a community of people with OCD or people with autism spectrum disorder. That being said, I often recognize when somebody is struggling with one or both of those things, and will be able to understand and be compassionate and or to assist. And
because of your own experiences, you mean?
And so in that way, I suppose there's sort of a natural connection there. People aren't always open to talking about their difficulties or asking for help. And the rule of thumb, with assisting people with mental health related concerns is, you can ask if they would like to talk, or if there's something that's on their mind or something they would like help with. But unless they actually
Hello?
to just intrude.
You disappeared there for a moment. I don't know why.
Oh, there was a phone call that came in, and I just hit.
Yeah. May I move on to the next question, simply because I'm so sorry, it's just so interesting listening to everything that you're saying. Unless you feel that, sorry, was there something in that you were just finishing that I've kind of cut you off with now?
No, it's I know that there are people who really very much identify with the challenges that they have, and even are part of support groups and things of that nature. But that's not really me. But I do know that there are people who do that. Yeah.
Well, I like the way you said that. You said that it's a part of you. It's not your entire identity. It doesn't define you, but it is a part of you. So I can see that you're able to recognize those things in other people, and I can see how I can understand that it's a part of you, but it doesn't define you. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And everybody's different, aren't they? So really, I'll move on, if I may, to the question: what do you think is the value of being diagnosed or self-diagnosed with neurodivergence, and that really encompasses also when you found out that you were neurodivergent? And what kind of, when you found out, was that then a diagnosis, or did you diagnose yourself? And did that give value to your life to know about that?
Yeah. So in the case of the OCD, I just found it extremely odd, but it wasn't formally diagnosed until I was about 30. In the case of the Asperger's, not diagnosed until mid-50s.
Oh, really?
So very different thing. In the case of the OCD diagnosis, it was helpful to have that, because it opened the doors to cognitive behavioral therapy. And eventually that proved useful. But with these things, the more years that go by where a person is succumbing to the illness without having strategies to deal with it, the longer that goes on without the diagnosis and without the specialized help, the more debilitating the illness can be. And so if it took 20 years to get to a certain state, sometimes it takes a great deal of time to undo things with appropriate strategies. In the case of right, in the case of the Asperger's, receiving a diagnosis at the age of about 55 was certainly, I don't know, it precipitated a bit of grief because it made sense of a great deal of things, and I wish I had known.
Retrospectively,
Yeah,
so
I wish
of your life in some way, in a retrospective sense.
Yeah, I wish I had known 50 years earlier. But so you go through a bit of grief, but at the same time, I'm glad I know. I hadn't mentioned something that's a difficulty with Asperger's. It's reading people's facial expressions. I find that extremely difficult. And so I will study people's faces in order to sort of make my own catalog of their expressions, and then correlate that with, things they say when they're making certain facial expressions. And that's how I tell whether something is an angry face or a sad face or a happy face. And I dare say that's not how most people interpret visual cues. They look at somebody's face and they see a smile and they know what that means. And so I have to go through this extra step. So what happens, the way this appears to other people, there might be a delay between the time I see somebody's expression and the time when I know, okay, it's okay to laugh. And the other thing that happens is sometimes people find it unnerving. They think I'm staring at them. And really all I'm doing is looking intently, hoping to interpret what I'm seeing.
So I'm guessing that you've had that all your life and you didn't really understand it all those years, maybe, or maybe you suspected, but until you had your diagnosis mid-50s, then I suppose that must have been something that must also have been confusing to you, maybe, because you thought that other people were managing it and why were you not? Is that right? Or
yes,
am I assuming something there?
No, that's correct. And, if I had known, for example, that, there are techniques, for example, for people to learn how to read faces. I mean, there are cue cards with drawings on them, and you can look at those and somebody can talk you through it and say, well, right, this is an amused kind of face. This is a grimacing kind of face, and whatever, right? And it's not perfect, but it does help.
So may I just ask, sorry.
Yeah.
Did you work all of this out on your own then in these years? Or did you start using the cue cards when you were in your 50s, or had you already developed these techniques yourself?
Yeah, I learned all this myself without, without even understanding what I was doing. I sort of knew that this was necessary, but at the same time, I had no idea other people didn't do this.
Okay. So basically, I need to ask then, well, the next question is actually, when do you disclose your neurodivergence and how comfortable are you disclosing? I feel like I will go on to ask the other question I'm burning to ask in a minute. Let's go to this next one. Sorry.
So I have told friends, I typically don't, disclose, you know, in a public forum or even in the workplace. I tend to disclose when I think it's necessary for for mutual understanding,
Yeah.
rather than sort of say,
So
right, well,
you mean when it
yeah,
becomes necessary?
yeah. So I'm not
Mm.
sort of planting a flag in the ground and saying, right,
Mhm.
well, this is me,
Yeah, yeah,
and so everybody else has to respond accordingly.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's when it's when it becomes necessary as a way of you know
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, um, overcoming a barrier or achieving some kind of rapprochement.
I
That
think it's very
that
interesting that you say that, actually, because I think that's quite um, a, a good thing to know, that
mm,
it's not something that one needs to feel, that one has to disclose up front, but one can feel perfectly comfortable about telling people
yeah.
if it's necessary.
Yeah, I'm a certain age, right? I'm in my
Mm.
60s, and so I don't worry too much about stigma. I mean, if someone wants to say, "Well, what a
Yeah.
screwball," I mean, I'm not going to be bothered by that, right?
No,
But
no.
I do know that younger people or people who don't necessarily have skills to manage their conditions,
Mm.
they might be very loath to say anything that might make them feel even worse, or make them feel that other people were having a particular view of them,
Mm.
that where they might think somebody thinks I'm weird. Uh,
Mm.
I can well understand why they wouldn't want to disclose in a situation like that. But I I've done a lot of volunteering here in the mental health community, and um, I encourage people, to share what they feel comfortable sharing, but also
Mhm.
at the same time to help them to sort of see that, hey, look, mm, you know, mental illness of one kind or another is widespread,
Mhm.
and so it may be that other people around you are suffering too, in
Mm.
which case, you know, uh, to the extent that it's possible, rather than sort of waving a flag saying, poor me,
Yeah.
we might try a different approach and sort of think, wow, I wonder if that person's all right, or if there's something that I can do or say that may be helpful to them without embarrassing them. And
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
sort of to get outside of yourself, and that's not always easy to do when you're suffering, right? And
Mm.
when somebody's in a great deal of pain, to ask them, to stay calm probably
Yeah,
isn't the
yeah.
most
Mhm.
helpful thing to
But
do,
if they know,
right?
but if people nowadays know that they can say that, to bring it up if they need to, and the
Yeah,
world seems to be changing in that direction. So
yeah,
effectively, that also leads on to the next question, which is, well, I think you've pretty much covered that, actually. What do you wish people knew about neurodivergent students or employees or lecturers like
yeah,
yourself?
yeah. I think it's important to understand that people's brains work differently. I mean, we're all human, but
Mhm.
people's brains do work differently, and the neurodivergence, at least as I've described it from my own experience, is not a particularly frightening thing. It is, as I say, sometimes an annoyance, but sometimes an annoyance to myself. But at the same time, something that I regard as a gift because it's extremely helpful. And
Mm.
so I tend to look on balance at the thing and sort of say, right, well, um, as much as certain things connected with OCD are very annoying and time consuming,
Yeah.
there are other things that come very easily to me, um, and um, and I'm grateful for that. Um, So I think, I suppose, one general rule of thumb is, I don't think you need to feel sorry for anybody who has a challenge, a neurodivergence challenge. And it may be that having conversation on mutually agreed upon terms, where somebody is only disclosing what they feel comfortable or not disclosing at all, but having some awareness of what neurodivergence might look like, and just sort of saying, right, well, I'm just going to play along with this just to sort of see where this goes, and so it can be an interesting challenge. But of course, there are other forms of neurodivergence that I know nothing about, that are quite frightening to me. For example, people experiencing schizophrenia, and especially the aspects of schizophrenia that involve hearing voices or being part of an alternate reality. I don't understand those things, find them frightening, and I wish I knew more. So that's a gap in my own awareness that I wish I could fill somehow.
Well, that's the good thing about Brain Awareness Week, and the fact that neurodiversity, neurodivergence are terms which are becoming more and more popular or understood at the moment, isn't it? Because it means that people are beginning to become aware of these things and start to ask themselves questions and start to try to understand, and basically to see that we all have our brains work in different ways, all of us, and there are so many varieties of the way people think, and it's really clear speaking to you that that's the case, that the way that you think, the way that you speak, and the things that go on sort of behind the scenes for so many people are so different from what we see on the surface, aren't they? Just coming on to say, I was just going to continue with the last couple of questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think you've pretty much covered this, but I'll ask it anyway. What advice would you give to other people in your position, or people who support individuals in your position? And I'll link that up with the final question, which is, what kind of developments would you like to see in the future?
Yes. So, given that there are a lot of resources already available, for example, if we're talking about, university students, there's typically, it goes by different names, but an Office of Student Success or something similar, where students who do have challenges with neurodivergence can go. And it's a safe place where people who understand these things, work. And they may be able to help a student, for example, to get certain accommodations if they need to take a bit longer to take an exam, for example. So there are resources like that available, and people shouldn't hesitate, just to go forward and make use of those resources. But of course, I think the primary thing here is, you have to be able to be comfortable in your own skin if you're going to be able to go forward and seek help. Even if that help is not, where somebody, puts a label on your forehead and says, right, well, it's okay then. But sort of, I think you need to somehow or other be comfortable in your own skin and sort of say, hey, look, whatever this is, it's okay talking, for example, with a medical professional about it, or some sort of a peer supporter. And there are people around who play that role. And, who can act as a sounding board and sort of say, hey, this seems very odd to me, and I don't think other people experience this. What do you think? Part of the challenge is people don't want to feel weird. But my experience has always been that when I've gone forward looking for help, people have been very, very supportive and not judgmental at all. They've sort of taken some of the mystery out of it, and I found that useful. So that's something. So, I'd encourage people just to, try to feel comfortable in their own skin, and be comfortable enough to go forward and sort of say, hey, look, what does this all mean? Or have you seen this before? That's a good kind of question to ask. Have you seen this before?
Do you think, sorry, just bringing back to something that you were saying earlier, where you were saying that you didn't necessarily feel a part of the community, but you weren't separate from the community nevertheless. I just wondered, do you think that it helps to have the sense that there are other people, if you go looking for support as a student, or anybody else really looking for help anywhere, do you think it helps, to know that there are other people who are experiencing similar things? Or
Yes, I do. The one caution I would give is, there are some sort of peer support groups, or I take the word peer out, just support groups for various conditions. But unless they're very well facilitated, they can be problematic. So, for example, I've seen cases where people appear, with a group of people who apparently share the same diagnosis, and some will dominate a conversation and say, hey, look, I've got it worse than you do, so you really don't understand. And if these groups were properly facilitated, people would realize, hey, look, better and worse, or more serious and less serious, they don't really matter. Matters is, if people are wanting to share something and get feedback, then you let them share without, and you don't judge. You can share from your own experience and say, hey, I've experienced something similar, and here's what I do. But not to judge and sort of say, wow, I don't even know why you're here. You don't, you clearly, I'm suffering more than you. And so,
I suppose if you are actually aware that there are people out there who, I'm guessing that in the past when you were young, I don't know, but I'm just wondering, maybe if it might have been easier for you to have known that that there were other people out there with who were going through the same things. Do you think?
Yeah, it would have been useful. I'll share this because when I was in my late 20s, there was a book that appeared about saints, and the subject of the book, or the theme of the book, was that perhaps certain saints were anorexic, and that an eating disorder was connected with the way they appeared in the world. And I didn't understand eating disorders, although I had one at the time. And I just thought it was extremely weird. But when I saw this book, I sort of thought, oh, this is interesting. But I didn't think more about it at the time. But it came back to me from time to time. And in fact, when I did seek medical help for OCD, I mentioned this book to the psychologist, and she said to me, yes, I've seen that book. And in fact, here's my take on it. But what she also said to me was, you asked when you approached me about the OCD whether I'd seen it before. Yes, I have. How does that make you feel now, the fact that I've seen this before? And I said, oh, that's a great relief, because I thought this was so strange. I couldn't imagine anybody had seen this before. And she said, no. And so she said, it is something I've seen before. Many others have seen this before. And so that helped in the first instance.
I can see that would have been a really nice sort of, I can't think of the word now, a confirmation that it wasn't such a strange thing and that it was something that other people experience. And that really is the idea of understanding the idea of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, is basically linking everybody together, I suppose. That's my understanding of it.
So
we all
right.
are aware.
Right. So understanding is important. Self-awareness on the part of an individual, understanding on the part of people in the community in general, and people who are playing support roles. But then the other side of all of this is, compassion. So we talk about understanding, which is part of what brains do, but compassion is another thing. And so self-compassion, don't beat yourself up and think you're yourself a weirdo. But also showing that compassion to others who may be experiencing difficulties, even if they haven't disclosed or are not comfortable disclosing, and even if it's not entirely clear what's going on, and that can help. Showing someone a little bit of kindness or compassion. Who knows? They may open up and share something with you. They may not. But the fact that you mindfully or intentionally show compassion to others will just make their lives a little bit easier, even if there is no discussion, whatever, of what's going on.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that's the absolutely perfect place for us to end, because that's a really lovely sentiment. And so, unless you want to add something specific that you really want to say, I would say.
No, I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's good.
Do you agree?
Yeah.
So do go ahead, and if there's one more thing that you would really like to say, do say it. Otherwise, I'll.
Yeah, no, I think I've shared quite a bit. There's nothing more than what we've talked about that comes to mind, so it's a good place to close.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place. I have to say, I think that everyone listening will find the interview as interesting and informative as I've done. And I hope you've enjoyed being part of it.
Yeah, sure.
Being part of our Brain Awareness Week.
Yeah.
Really, really thank you so much for giving your time and for agreeing to do the interview. It was really, really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. So,
stop the recording now.
Okay.
Okay.
To our listeners, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening to our podcast and being part of Arden's third Brain Awareness Week celebration. Through these interviews, we explore neurodivergent identity, key ways to mitigate and celebrate neurodivergent needs and skills, and interesting ideas for future brain-related research that some of you listeners might end up being a part of. This year we have a selection of podcast episodes along with an art competition. If you'd like some more information or a chance to be involved in next year's events, email baw@arden.ac.uk. Once again, a big thank you to all our guests and to the Brain Awareness team who made this podcast possible. And with that being said, take care and hydrate your brains.